talk about SABMiller. You know us well, one of the world's leading brewers, hundreds of beer brands, 70,000 plus employees, over 75 countries. But we really think about ourselves as the local global brewer, and I think you actually mentioned it already, Roland. So beer has always been a local product, grown, consumed in local communities. What we also recognise, though, is that we can't source everything everywhere, right? So when we source locally, we have to really focus on the crops that are adapted to the local climate, to the local soils, to the local farming structures, and where those structures or that infrastructure isn't in place, see, well, what is it that how can we play our part in making sure that that is the case? Because actually we need to make sure that crops, if they're going to be grown locally, can be grown productively and sustainably over the long term. Farms don't run without people, and farms have massive impacts on the surrounding rural communities, and we try to keep that in mind. And of course, we have to remember that farming at its most basic level has a very core social purpose that's about feeding people, and that's the real link to food security. So we get that we need to understand and we need to manage all of these natural resource, financial resource, people resource issues, the needs and the impacts related to all of our crops in order for us to protect our supply for the future. In agriculture, I think this is now a very familiar figure to lots of you, but agriculture accounts for somewhere around 70% of global freshwater withdrawals, and that's going up as meat and dairy consumption increase. It's a huge issue in lots of Africa, Southern and Western Asia, and the Middle East. First of all, I wanted to touch on growing grosh, and I'm looking at Jos, who can take most of the credit for this. But this program in the Netherlands is really about working closely with farmers to embed more sustainable farm management practices through working and establishing in that chain from farmer to maltster through to brewer, and really focusing on identifying what are the real priority resource issues along that chain in these particular farming areas. In South Africa, we started working initially with the World Wildlife Fund, and together with them put together a set of guidelines, a framework for more sustainable barley farming, better barley, better beer, it's called. And the idea is, again, to work with the barley farmers that we source from over the long term to help to make their farming operations more sustainable, more resilient in the face of local climate change, to focus on improving yields, minimizing environmental impacts, which also can, through efficiency, reduce costs, improving soil health, but also taking into account things like the management of labour and the sort of social dimension. And in South Africa, particularly, alien vegetation is a huge issue and a huge drain on water resources. So one of the things that we identified with WWF and are now working on is, what can we do together with farmers to actually remove that alien vegetation and replace it with native species that are much more suitable for the local climate and are not draining water resources in the same way. Boosting crop yields, improving agricultural productivity, supporting a more efficient agricultural sector has to be an absolute priority, and we at SABMiller think we have a real role to play in this as well. I mentioned our cassava-based beer, and we really see the use of crops like cassava and sorghum in beer as a key way that we can support against tackling some of these issues through supporting better economic development. So part of, I talked already about food security and nutrition. If we can find ways to actually help farmers to generate an income from the staples that they grow, staples like cassava, which are nutritionally quite poor, we can actually help them to have the funds to then buy a more diverse set of foodstuffs. So supporting buying cassava enables them to increase their yields, retain cassava to eat, cassava to sell into local food markets, and through selling cassava into the brewing supply chain, then actually also be able to purchase other foodstuffs. But some of the other things that we're looking at are, and how can we also work with those farmers to help them to grow other vegetable crops, for example, alongside the staples. So there are some real tangible things that we can do and that we're thinking about in the way that we work with farmers, both in the developed world, where it tends to be more around resource efficiency and reducing costs and reducing environmental impact, and in the developing world, where it may be much more linked to this social piece that I talked about at the beginning, and how do we support livelihoods and food security.